Hello, everyone. Welcome to Other Voices Online, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope everyone is doing well. As cities and towns around the country continue to struggle with the questions of systemic racism in our law enforcement and legal institutions, one hears a great deal of talk about implicit bias, unconscious prejudices against perceived outsiders. Many reform efforts include requiring implicit bias training for law enforcement officers. As this evening's guest wrote in a recent report for the Brennan Center for Justice, quote, "These reforms, while well-intentioned, leave unaddressed an especially harmful form of bias, which remains entrenched within law enforcement, explicit racism. While it is widely acknowledged that racist officers exist within police departments around the country, federal, state, and local governments are doing far too little to proactively identify them," end quote. For this installment of Other Voices, we'll take a look at explicit racism in law enforcement and what can and must be done to address the problem. Michael German is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. A former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his work focuses on law enforcement and intelligence oversight and reform. Mike's work with the FBI included infiltrating white supremacist groups. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Mike German served as the Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy for the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. Michael German, welcome back to Other Voices. It's been a few years. How are you?
It has been. Thanks very much for having me again.
Good to have you here. In your report, and we'll be sending this link out to everybody, for those of you who haven't joined us online before, we do send a resource email afterwards with links for you to follow, and we will be sending a link for Michael German's report, which we stole to title this program, Hidden in Plain View. In your report, Michael, you break down explicit bias into a couple of broad categories. So let's start there. There's people who have affiliations and just plain racists who are in the police department. Do I have that right?
Exactly right. And basically what I started the report discussing that I found interesting was when I was preparing to go undercover in white supremacist groups, my superiors warned me that, you're doing this as part of a joint terrorism task force with other federal, state, and local law enforcement. And there's a history of subjects of domestic terrorism cases having relationships with law enforcement and law enforcement sympathy for those viewpoints. So you have to be particularly careful. And I'll say that, I did work closely with state and local law enforcement in that case and another undercover case targeting far-right militias. Those were great law enforcement officers who heard the same message and didn't suggest that it was anything but reasonable. That we take some precautions to make sure we're limiting the knowledge within their police departments about the investigation. In 2006, another report, an FBI report came out publicly through a Freedom of Information Act request that made that warning in writing. So it wasn't just that I knew this from my time in the FBI, but now it was publicly known, and yet the FBI had no national program to identify these individuals or to protect the public from them. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the report, just to acknowledge that this problem of white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement is real and documented, but also that there are many who share those ideological viewpoints, but perhaps are smart enough not to actually join or associate with an active domestic terrorist group. And likewise, there are a lot of people who perhaps would be unwilling to affiliate with white supremacists, overt white supremacists, but the way the far-right militant groups work is often by either masking their white supremacy, so they call themselves militias or other things, or focusing other elements on far-right ideology. So I included all three: the active white supremacists, people who engage in racist violence, and people who associate with far-right militant groups.
Right. Well, let's talk about these groups for a minute. A couple of things you just said has, I have follow-up questions. You were doing this infiltration work back in the 1990s, right? So this was a problem going back 20 years and probably before that.
Oh, certainly before that. And
Yes.
I go through in the report a little bit of the history of white supremacy in law enforcement. And, oftentimes when white supremacy is discussed, it's discussed as this sort of fringe ideology, something on the outskirts of our society. And I don't think people realize that how foundational it is. And that's something that I was taught when I infiltrated these groups and joined them, and they educated me about their perspective. You have to understand that the foundation of our nation was established on white supremacy philosophies and ideologies that justified European colonization. They justified slavery, African slave trade. They justified the genocide of indigenous peoples. And these ideologies and philosophies and theologies never went away. They were simply suppressed little by little, right? That even after slavery was banished, Jim Crow still established white supremacy by law. The laws that police were enforcing enforced white supremacy, the primacy of the white race over other races. And that kept on even beyond the civil rights movement to the establishment and maintenance of sundown towns where people of color were not allowed to be present after sundown. And those, again, were enforced by law enforcement.
And that was North and South, right? It wasn't just in the South, right?
Absolutely. And that's one thing to keep in mind, that, while slavery was predominantly in the South, that didn't mean racism and white supremacy were predominantly in the South. They were everywhere. And particularly after slavery was ended, you had these vigilante groups forming, Ku Klux Klan being one of them. But people don't realize the Ku Klux Klan wasn't just in the Deep South. They were spread across the nation, all the way to here in California. There were active Ku Klux Klan organizations through history. So this is a problem everywhere. You go back, the state of Oregon was founded as a white state.
Whites only, yeah.
Right. There's I keep forgetting his name. David Lowen, I think is his name, wrote a book on sundown towns and found something like 100 of them in his home state of Illinois alone.
Wow.
But nationwide found at least 1,000 of these towns that were operating at least through the 1970s. So this was a pervasive issue, and we still see the persistence of that structural white supremacy in all of our institutions, but particularly in the criminal justice system, where Black people are stopped, Black and brown people are stopped more regularly, searched more regularly, arrested more often, punished more harshly, victims of police violence more regularly, and also treated, given less service when they're victims of crime. When you look at unsolved crime in this country, it disproportionately impacts communities of color. So it's both sides of it, which is why I think when the Black Lives Matter advocates talk about this, and particularly around defunding police, where people will say, wait a minute, we need the police to protect us. In these communities, the police aren't protecting them, or certainly not protecting them as effectively as they should. So It's a matter of actually looking at what the real facts are and understanding the depths of the maintenance of this structural racism that exists. But we can't really address that structural racism and the unconscious bias unless we deal with the conscious bias and the active white supremacy that still remains.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the history of these white supremacist groups, right-wing militant groups, and law enforcement officers. You go into quite a bit of this history in your report. Numerous incidents, but give us a little arc of history, a thumbnail view of what's in your much longer report about this history of this relationship.
Sure. So, when we talk about law enforcement actively working with groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the civil rights era, most people know that history, and the murders of civil rights workers that law enforcement was actively involved in. But even after the civil rights movement, it never went away. And I talk about cases in the 1970s and 80s, and even in the 90s when I was working here in Los Angeles with the FBI. There was a scandal involving a Los Angeles Sheriff's Department gang. The judge called it a white supremacist gang, the Vikings, operating within the Sheriff's Department. And those gangs still allegedly exist and are still causing problems for the Sheriff's Department. But basically throughout history, we identify individuals or groups of individuals. And it's fascinating to look at the cases because often their involvement with white supremacist groups is known to their management. It's known to others in the police department, but either because they feel that there aren't strong policies that directly prohibit that kind of association, so long as no public attention is drawn to their activities with white supremacist groups, the police department can't take action or won't take action. And it's only once it reaches a public scandal that the police department then takes action to either fire or discipline them.
Only when it does become a public scandal.
Right, exactly. When either some investigative reporter or some mistake by the person uncovers their involvement in these groups. And the public demands a response, do we see that response? And often that response is severe. It results in a termination. And often these officers will go through the arbitration process or challenge their termination in court. And courts have upheld the termination, arguing that the First Amendment rights of public employees are somewhat restricted, and where particularly in law enforcement, association with a particular group is incompatible with that public service, they've upheld these terminations. But in some cases they haven't, and the courts or the arbitrators have given these officers their jobs back. And
okay. All right. I think I lost my signal there for a little bit. I'm not sure what happened. Suddenly I was checking into the room again and I had never checked out. So
okay.
I'm not sure you heard my question. Earlier in your introductory remarks, you referred to an FBI internal report in 2006 that we didn't know about until someone got it under a FOIA, Freedom.
Right, exactly. And this was
report talk about some of this history, this long history of this kind of association?
Sure. So this 2006 report was entitled "White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement," and it somewhat the title overstates what they're talking about or misstates what they're talking about, because it's not just that white supremacist groups want to try to get law enforcement jobs so they get that training, which is true, but also what it called the self-infiltration, this idea that the people in law enforcement would be attracted to these ideologies and involve themselves with these groups. So it's not necessarily that somebody is sneaking in. It could be that some police officer is deciding to join one of these groups, or perhaps found them later in their career. But it's been a persistent problem. There's quite a bit of research on it. There's a Georgetown law professor named Vida B. Johnson who issued a report called KKK and the PD, where she actually has a database documenting these cases. But they're fairly persistent. But again, these are cases that come to the public light almost by accident. There's no national program, even though the FBI warns its own agents. And with that 2006 report, it wasn't setting up a program to identify them or protect the public. It was just warning agents that you have to protect your cases.
Right.
So you should be careful. It said that the primary problem with white supremacist infiltration is the integrity of FBI investigations. That it
Tipping your hand that you're investigating them. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting view of the
right. And we have to, again, getting back to that structural racism, the FBI remains a predominantly white and predominantly male organization. So, that they don't see as a serious threat to their own communities, white supremacist violence. So it's harder for them to recognize that they also have responsibility for protecting the civil rights of the American public. And that, I believe, should have been prioritized once you recognize that this white supremacist infiltration remains an issue.
Let's go from there to some of the problems that do arise, not just tipping, blowing FBI investigations, but some real world problems that come from having a lot of police involved with these white supremacist or right-wing militant militia groups. And the first one that comes to my mind is someone who organizes demonstrations and is watching these right-wing counter demonstrations. There seems to be some, at least anecdotal evidence arising from videotape of stuff of local law enforcement actually favoring the right-wingers over the Black Lives Matter protesters out there in the streets. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and that's, again, was one of the alarming things that I saw that made me believe it was necessary to write a report like this. Starting around 2016, we had become used to watching the law enforcement response to Black Lives Matter protests or Standing Rock water protector protests, which were generally peaceful, at least not interpersonal violence occurring at these protests. And yet you had a very aggressive and militaristic police response with tear gas and rubber bullets and aggressive riot control tactics, kettling, mass arrests. We saw that at the Occupy protests as well, where in 2016, we started seeing these very violent white supremacist and far-right militant protests that were lightly policed, if at all. And people remember Charlottesville for that, but Charlottesville was actually about the 5th or 6th or 7th in a series of protests. And they were a couple in Berkeley, California, Sacramento, California, Huntington Beach, California, Anaheim, California, and Portland, where I could watch, because I was following a lot of the local reporters, watch these events unfold where individuals who engaged in violence at the protests, who were part of these far-right groups, would become celebrities within the white supremacist or far-right militant movements, and would go from protest to protest based on the celebrity of the violence they engaged in, public violence that they engaged in these protests. And yet you saw very little police interference with that. And particularly when they started traveling interstate, it was very troubling to me how the FBI wasn't recognizing what was happening. And I think some of it is that there is some empathy in law enforcement for these viewpoints. And since the George Floyd protests, these have become more obvious, where we've seen police officers actually wearing the patches of far-right militant groups at the protests while they're policing Black Lives Matter protests, or otherwise engaging with far-right militants in a friendly manner, even as they're aggressively attacking peaceful protesters who aren't engaged in violence, aren't armed. So it's clearly an issue, and in my interactions with law enforcement since the reports come out, I haven't received a lot of pushback. I think it's something that, just like the FBI reports made clear, it was something that was known inside of law enforcement, but people were just unwilling to talk about it publicly. So hopefully the report will bring some public light to the issue so that we can begin to address it.
That's what we're hoping to do tonight. And I know I've heard you on any number of interviews on NPR. And so I hope your report does have that kind of impact. Going back to this question of problems caused by these sorts of affiliations, or even the individual racist cops that aren't part of an organization, but carry these feelings, and especially you're mentioning, the differing reactions at various Black Lives Matter protests these days. These same police officers will be testifying in court, and there's no way. How do we know that they're telling the truth? Is there? I know you addressed this in your report, that there should be a way to do this forcibly, but we're not keeping track.
Right, and again, due process is important. So when an accusation is made against a police officer and there's a determination through the system that termination isn't justified, in the past that has led to the police department just throwing up their hands and that officer being allowed to remain on the police department, go through regular promotions, and continue to put the community at risk. Where my recommendations are, they should have a mitigation strategy. There are plenty of law enforcement jobs that don't involve interacting with the public. And perhaps that would be one method of taking this person who has engaged in racist misbehavior and saying, okay, for whatever reason, the adjudicator has said that we can't terminate you, we can at least protect the public from you, whether it's greater supervision, whether it's training. Each of these situations is going to be different. And certainly, I'm sure the spectrum of different activities could be different as well. But the only way the police are going to regain the public trust after one of these episodes is if there is a public mitigation strategy that demonstrates their commitment to protecting the public from racist officers. And one of those strategies that Vida Johnson, the Georgetown professor, put forward, but I wholeheartedly agree with, is to put them on Brady lists. The Supreme Court in Brady determined that if the government holds any exculpating evidence against the defendant, they have to turn it over. And in a subsequent decision, Giglio, that any misconduct by a law enforcement officer or government witness that the government is aware of, the government that goes to the honesty of their testimony, the government has to turn that over as well. And I would support her argument that racist misbehavior falls into that category. And certainly where that person is testifying against the defendant, the fact that they hold racist views or engaged in racist behaviors or joined a white supremacist group would certainly be relevant evidence for the jury to determine whether their testimony was credible. So that would be one effective way of bringing prosecutors in because their commitments and obligations are different than law enforcement. So far, we've expected law enforcement to police itself, and that has proved insufficient. So this is a way of bringing a different level of government into play.
The self-policing does seem to be a constant problem. So let me just make sure I and our listeners understand this. A Brady list would be a list of people who hold these racist viewpoints, and since it may affect their testimony and could be exculpatory to a defendant, the prosecutor has an obligation under this Supreme Court decision to provide that information to the defense team that this is an untrustworthy cop.
Right, and not even that they're untrustworthy, but just that there are facts that the government is aware of that may go to the credibility of this person's testimony. And to be clear, in the report, I tried to stay away from racist ideology or racist ideas. You know, I'm always careful not to give the police more power than they already have. And I don't think law enforcement managers should be able to do deep ideological dives into their employees' mindsets, but rather where that comes out in conduct, right? If this police officer has engaged in racist misbehavior, that's something that needs to be reported, documented, and addressed, and a mitigation strategy that could include anything from termination to retraining. But in any event, that person would be put on a list. So the defendant and the defense attorney would have the ability to use that evidence to challenge the testimony that's presented. And not that testimony, you know, there are plenty of people who have lied in the past but are telling the truth this time. But without giving the defendant an opportunity to delve into that issue, the jury would never know that this might have been tainted by a racist. The testimony of this officer might be tainted by their racism that is demonstrated through previous misconduct.
So you have a couple other suggestions, recommended actions that we can take. And of course, one of the problems that a lot of towns are struggling with is law enforcement and policing is really a local kind of thing. But there are some things, I guess, that could be done starting at the federal level. And you've suggested a few, in a couple in your report. So let's go through some of the remedies that your report recommends. And then we'll bring our Zooming audience into this and bring them on online to ask some questions. But give us the thumbnail sketch of what you're recommending in your report for remedies for.
Sure.
Sort of.
One of the points that I make is the FBI not only warned me in the early 90s when I was doing this work, but again in writing in 2006 and again in 2015 in the FBI's counterterrorism policy guide. They again warn agents that when you open investigations against domestic terrorism investigations against white supremacists and far-right militants, they often have active links to law enforcement. So it warns them to keep the subject of the investigation's name off of the terrorist watch list. With normally when somebody is the subject of a terrorism investigation, they're automatically placed on the terrorist watch list. But because of this law enforcement connection, the FBI recommends that they use something called a silent hit, which would prevent a law enforcement officer who normally have access to the list to not be able to see that the list is there. And it's called a silent hit because the agent gets a notice that somebody searched for the name, but the police officer doing the search wouldn't see that person's on the list. And you know, to the extent that the FBI believes the terrorist watch list is something important to their counterterrorism measures, obviously forfeiting the use of this tool shows that it's at least a significant problem. But there's been no effort to identify these people or to measure the scope of the problem. So what I recommend is that the FBI use the tools that it has. Many times they work together with local law enforcement on task forces. And when they engage in that task force work, they do background investigations of those police officers. So there's an opportunity to investigate. The FBI has responsibility for working civil rights violations under color of law, which is basically police brutality cases. So when they do those investigations, make one element of it, you're already trying to find whether they intentionally violated this person's civil rights. You should look in to see what other behavior they were involved in that might demonstrate their racist motive for engaging in the act here. So by using these investigative tools, you could start to collect that information that could then be used to develop a more effective national strategy for how to address this problem.
One of the things we keep hearing over and over in this issue related to law enforcement is that we seem to be lacking a national database that keeps track of problematic police officers. They can get in trouble in one town and they can drive down the road and get hired by a police department down the street. Is there anything that can be done at the federal or a state level to require licensing, databases, background checks on these police?
Certainly. I mean, there are a lot of restrictions that get placed on law enforcement because they rely on the federal government for a significant portion of their funding. So when the government provides funds to these law enforcement agencies, they often come with requirements. So there's certainly there's certainly the opportunity to do that, but that's again where these Brady lists would be effective. And the reason I was so attracted to this potential reform when I saw Vida Johnson's report is that I was in the FBI when the Giglio case went through the Supreme Court, and it had a profound effect on the FBI because there were a number of agents who had gotten in trouble, tried to talk their way out of it by maybe not being as truthful as they could have been, and were caught and were disciplined, but had paid their debt and were continuing to work. But once that evidence had to be turned over to the defense attorneys, it basically made them completely ineffective as a working FBI agent, where they had to be moved into an area where they weren't going to be engaging in the kind of work that would make it likely that they would have to testify.
Right.
This black mark over their name would harm the image of the FBI. So seeing how effective that was, knowing that if a police department is about to hire somebody and they check the Brady list and this person is on it from their previous employment, they're not going to be very effective as police officers in your town, because anytime they testified, their misconduct would be revealed.
Yeah, as the old axiom goes, sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And you also make some recommendations for things that can be done at the local level. And I imagine our listeners are currently engaged in these sorts of debates in their various towns around the area. What can local departments, what can local activists insist upon from their local law enforcement departments?
So a lot of what the police departments lack are clear policies banning this type of activity. So typically when these cases come to public attention and the police department takes action, they do it under these generalized prohibitions against conduct that dishonors the police department or something like that. And so it results in prolonged litigation over what that means and whether the officer's conduct really violated that provision, where if they make strong and clear policies up front before there's a public scandal that that they need to respond to, they can be more effective both in making sure that the police officers know what the rules are, so they know what they can and can't do, but also later if they have to discipline those officers. One example is there was a scandal where a Philadelphia police officer's tattoo was similar to something that people perceived to be related to Nazi Germany. And so it became a public scandal, but it turned out the Philadelphia Police Department didn't have a tattoo policy. So they determined that they could not discipline this officer because there was no policy. And later they instituted a policy, but that officer was already grandfathered in. So that should be a wake-up call for other police departments. Before you have a scandal, go ahead and make a clear policy to make sure that if a problem arises, you have a policy put in place to address it. And then secondly, to have mitigation strategies and to make sure those are public when some officer his conduct does not justify termination, how you would continue to address that to retain public trust.
You make it clear to the public that you have a policy that person will be taken off a street beat and put on a desk job or something like that away from.
Right, and like I said, there are plenty of police jobs that don't involve enforcement actions directly with the public. So there would be plenty of places where that person could have a fulfilling career and the public would still be protected. Or, depending on the violation, maybe that officer just can't go out on the street with anyone below a superior officer who would be responsible for maintaining their conduct. Perhaps it's something like reviewing any use of force by that officer with a very skeptical view that if this officer is subject of a civilian complaint, we have this process where we're going to look at this case a little more diligently than we would an average case.
Okay, let's bring our audience in on this and get a little question and answer going. If you're watching at home, you have a question, we do like to bring you on camera. So what you need to do first is find the raise your hand button and click on that. And I can see who wants to ask questions. And then when our director, TD, starts to bring you on, it'll look like your Zoom screen almost disappears, but it'll come right back because you're being changed over to a panelist. You will have to click on your video button again. We cannot start your video remotely because of privacy concerns. Only the National Security Agency can do that.
Yeah.
We can't do that. So TD, let's bring on Margaret McAuliffe. She's the only one with her hand up right now. And while we wait for her, just quickly, there are a couple of bills in Congress that you recommend people support. Is that correct?
Yes, there are a couple. One was the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which actually calls for data production by the FBI. And interestingly, a provision of that bill was passed in the National Defense Authorization Act last year, and the FBI was supposed to turn over the data in June or July of this year, but they failed to produce that data. So that's one, and the Ending Racial Profiling Act is another.
Okay. TD, why don't you start bringing Patricia Evans on, and we will turn to Margaret with her question.
Yes, I'm
Margaret, welcome to Other Voices.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to know how this information is going to be disseminated locally. In particular, will this recording and Mike's specific recommendations to local police and law enforcement agencies, will this be forwarded to them? And how would those recommendations be enacted? Is that something that a city council would do? Or would it be an internal policy session by the police department? And who would kind of bird dog that through whatever the agency is? So what are your plans, Paul?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
So we published the report on the Brennan Center website and have done a considerable amount of press outreach. So I don't know that we had any plans to actually go deliver it to police departments, but obviously it's something that that is in their wheelhouse and comes up. And I do have the opportunity to speak to law enforcement audiences, so I know that they're aware of it. Some of the recommendations that police leadership can implement, and there are a number of police leaders that I have talked with. Some of them, it's up to the prosecutors. So there's, usually local city or county prosecutors, as well as state attorney generals, but also state legislatures or local legislatures can certainly require their police department to develop these policies and mitigation strategies. So it really would be part of the larger police reform discussion that is going on today, to make sure that while it's necessary to talk about those unconscious forms of bias, which are typical in the police reform process, that we're also addressing this issue of explicit bias.
Exactly. And again, I'll tell our viewers that what we do, we have your email addresses since you're here on Zoom with us, and we do send out a resource email. We will link to Mike's excellent report at the Brennan Center, and we'll also send you a link to this review that will be posted on YouTube in a couple of days. And when you get that email, if this is an issue that you're engaged in, I would strongly encourage you to send the links on to your city council members, your chief of police, whoever's involved in the debate in your town. I've often done that as a form of activism, is sharing these reports or videos like that. I think it's very effective. This program, a few months ago, the video of my interview with Judge Ladoris Cordell led to a public dialogue here in my hometown of Los Altos. Because I got a call, we need to talk to Ladoris. So that kind of activism does work. Patricia Evans, welcome to Other Voices. What's on your mind?
Hi.
Hi.
I wasn't surprised to see the topic or that Mike has done a study, but recent events and the fact that there is a study that's been done make me think that this is more prevalent than I was aware. And so I know you don't have the data, Mike, but I'm wondering what you can say about how prevalent is this? And I know it varies from area to area in the country, and there's a lot of factors, but as you look at the number of police departments, is there anything you can say about how big an issue is this? Can you put it on a scale from 1 to 10 where, 10 is, it's an issue in every police department, a significant issue, to 0 where we don't have to worry about this?
Right. Thanks for that. And it is frustrating because we don't have data, and I think it's part of my FBI training that I can only talk about what I know, right? And here's what we know. We know that the FBI and now the Department of Homeland Security have identified white supremacists as the *1 most lethal domestic terrorism threat in the United States. And we know that there is enough linkage between the subjects of FBI domestic terrorism investigations of white supremacists and far-right militants that they actually alter their process, and they warn their agents to alter their process. So if it's that significant a problem, I would say that by definition, it's something that needs to have a national program to address. And I don't know where since we don't have numbers, it's impossible to set a number, but what would be the percentage of white supremacist police officers that a community could live with, right? I would have to submit that it would be a very low percentage of white supremacist police
Excellent point,
officers,
yeah.
and still maintain any kind of public confidence that this department could properly serve its community. So certainly, there shouldn't be any resistance to having strong policies to prevent this from becoming a problem. And even if a police department would argue that we have no white supremacists or far-right militant fans in our department, there's no harm then in putting a very strong policy to ensure that your screening process for hiring new law enforcement officers wouldn't create that problem. And, as I said, we know that there are disparities in police use of racial disparities in police use of force, as an example. So I would argue that anytime there's a police use of force, this should be one of the issues that they're looking at. Are there other reasons to believe that this person's use of force had to do with their racist or militant ideology against these groups? And particularly as we're seeing the President of the United States imagine a domestic terrorism threat from what he calls Antifa, but are basically anti-fascists, arguing that the people who resist racism are the real terrorists, when there really isn't the kind of violence that we see from these far-right militant groups coming from any anti-fascist movements. That it's a way of basically identifying the team, and it's putting these far-right militants and the police on the same team targeting anti-fascists. And so the police violence against these groups, I would argue, is something that needs to be considered and examined when we're trying to identify the scope of the problem of racism and white supremacy in law enforcement.
Excellent ideas. I see, it occurs to me when you were in the FBI, I guess you were Antifa back then, weren't you?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it's, just another example of how that term is being misused and weaponized in a way that doesn't describe what is actually the activity, which is anti-fascism. And of course, the reason they don't use the full term anti-fascism is because if you're anti-fascism, that doesn't speak well for what side you're on.
That's right. Okay, I see Margaret is back on here. TD, can you go ahead and bring on Wendy and Christy next? Margaret, did you have another question? Follow up?
I just wanted to follow up with local things like, is Peninsula Peace and Justice planning to let's see, do I have to do anything?
No, you're good.
Planning to contact local law enforcement, Santa Clara County, Palo Alto, Los Altos. I live in Menlo Park, so our police, San Mateo County, like who's going to do that? It's one thing to put it on a list or put it on a website, but that would require someone within the department wanting to go to the website and find out and pursue it versus outside pressure to do that. And I will be going to our city council because I know some of the members of our city council, but I remember when our police chief in Menlo Park resigned, one of the things that was at issue at that time was this whole issue of racist police. And I asked him a question in a town hall meeting that he didn't really address. And he got quite angry. Remember, he stomped out of that meeting and says, I'm going to take my bat and ball and go home, essentially. So I just wonder, what are your plans for these other local agencies? Because I'm really, I suspected all along when I certainly saw that guy on George Floyd's neck. I said, wow, this guy, I mean, he had his hand in his pocket, like,
yeah. Very casual.
Yeah.
Well, what I can tell you that the Peace and Justice Center will do is we will share the report and a link to this video with the police chiefs and mayors. Well, these days you can email the entire city council in each town.
Yeah.
On the peninsula, our general membership areas like San Mateo to Sunnyvale or Cupertino. And we will also encourage through the 2,500 names on our email list, people to do the same in their own towns, so that maybe we can start generating some heat and light that way. So,
and I have, I work for a public policy think tank, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, but I have engaged with local activists. I testified in the Portland City Council and the Oakland City Council, San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the Oregon State Legislature. So, if there are groups that will organize an effort, I'm happy to assist as I'm able, but certainly can provide the information that's included in the report and any updates.
That's terrific. A very generous offer of your time and energy. Maybe sharing this report around will lead to some invitations to come and testify. Let's hope so. Okay, here is Wendy. Hello, Wendy. Wendy is a member of our board of directors. I should probably make that known. Wendy, what's your question? And welcome to Other Voices. Wendy, you're muted. Unmute yourself. You're muted.
Is that better?
That's better. We want to
Okay.
hear you too.
This is
There
a
you
bit
go.
off your central topic, but I'm wondering about looting and general destruction that sometimes follows peaceful protests, and wondered if you know of any evidence that would show that some of these episodes might be instigated by the extreme right. Are you aware of anything like that?
Thank you for that question. Interesting that there was a case in Minneapolis where the George Floyd protests started, of course, where there was an unusually dressed man who was the first to break windows at a shopping center that later burned. That was so unusual in his behavior that the protesters called him out for it and videotaped him doing it and forced him to ultimately leave. But it was later revealed in a search warrant that the Minneapolis police believed that was a white supremacist who was part of a racist motorcycle gang who had engaged in that. And the FBI had at the time issued warnings to the local police that these far-right militant and white supremacist groups were organizing in order to instigate violence at the protests and destruction at the protests to make it look like the Black Lives Matter activists was doing it. Unfortunately, what we see at the protests is not a lot of enforcement action taken against the far-right militants. So I don't know how aggressively they've pursued those leads, but there is at least some anecdotal evidence that it occurs.
And again, the problem of this close relationship between some of these cops and these organizations, leads don't get followed up. Okay, we have time for one more, and we have a questioner here, Christy Iverson. Christy, welcome to Other Voices. What's your question?
My question is around the police unions. My understanding is that sometimes the arbitration clauses and some of the things in the agreements with the unions prevent some corrective actions from occurring. So what is your opinion about the role of the police unions and how that should be approached?
So that's absolutely right, that a lot of times the arbitration that gets created from these union contracts is favorable to the police officers. And, it's up to every city and their representatives to negotiate these contracts in a way that protects the public. And maybe this is an opportunity to look at some of those contracts and see where they need to be amended through the process. I do try to be cautious in, again, how we empower police managers, right? If we empower police managers to survey the beliefs of their agents or officers and fire people whose beliefs they disagree with, I think it's probably going to be racist and white supremacists who aren't harmed nearly as much as people who have reform ideas. So we do have to be careful, and we have to make sure that we're doing that through a process that sustains legal challenges, and involving the city attorneys and the representatives is essential to that. But also that they establish strong policies to protect police whistleblowers, because again, the officers often know about their colleagues' behavior, but if they
would
aren't
be the first to know
for reporting it, then they're not going to report it. And it's only once this information is brought to light that the police department it can be compelled to deal with it. So if those channels are open and the protections are solid, then the police can be better at policing themselves.
All right. Well, that brings us right up to the end of our time here. I'll just ask you, Mike, if you have any closing thoughts. I think you see that there's some enthusiasm out there to follow up on this. So
absolutely. And number one, just thank you again for having me and for spreading more awareness of the report and the issues. And I'd be happy to engage if a group does decide to try to bring this to greater attention locally. And you know, this is not a new problem. It's something that's been with us for some time, but only if we take it square on. I mean, one of the things that I found problematic, I quote 3 separate teachers, instructors who engage in implicit bias training, who said that they go out of their way not to mention overt racism within the police department. And I'm not sure how effective implicit bias training can be if we're not acknowledging that overt and explicit bias exists as well.
absolutely. Well, Michael German, thank you so much for joining us here. I encourage all our viewers to check out brennancenter.org. It's one of my favorite websites. I find a lot of good stuff there. And in the mail today was a fundraiser from Brennan Center, so I'm going to go write a check too. Michael German, fellow with Brennan Center for Justice. Thank you so much for joining us. All of you watching at home, thank you for joining us. We'll be back soon. Don't know when, but we'll be back.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care now. Bye-bye.